On October 14, 1066, the last Anglo-Saxon king of England fell on the blood-soaked field of Hastings. Harold Godwinson, only 44 years old, was struck by an arrow through the eye as he fought to defend his crown. His death ended not just a man's life, but an entire era, opening the gates for foreign conquest and altering England's destiny forever. England in the early 11th century was a land of fragile stability, balanced on the edge of uncertainty. Harold Godwinson was born in 1022, the son of Godwin, the powerful Earl of Wessex. The Godwin family was not royal by blood, but they commanded influence that rivaled kings. Through marriages, alliances, and sheer political acumen, they became the backbone of Anglo-Saxon aristocracy. From a young age, Harold grew up amid the wealth and turbulence of this household. His father had risen to prominence during the reign of King Canute the Great, and Harold inherited both ambition and a keen sense of survival. And in a world where kings were often weak and easily swayed by noble factions, it was the earls who held true power. And among them, the Godwins stood supreme. By the time Harold became Earl of Wessex in 1053, he had already distinguished himself as a capable warrior and statesman. Wessex was not just a territory. It was the richest and most strategically important earldom in England. Its fertile lands and access to the southern coast made Harold's power unmatched. His charisma, military skill, and ability to command loyalty ensured that he was more than just another noble. He was the figure people looked to in times of crisis. The reign of King Edward the Confessor, Harold's brother-in-law, was marked by both piety and weakness. Edward had no children, and his detachment from worldly affairs left England vulnerable to both internal strife and foreign intrigue. Harold, however, emerged as the practical ruler in all but name. He negotiated disputes, commanded armies, and acted as the king's shield. In the eyes of the Anglo-Saxon people, Harold embodied the values they cherished: loyalty to the land, courage in battle, and protection of the local traditions. He was not a distant monarch cloaked in divine mystique, but a leader who walked among his people. His presence at assemblies and on the battlefield created a sense of connection that Edward could never achieve. The Anglo-Saxon world of Harold's youth was one rooted in ancient customs. The language, the laws, the bonds of lordship and kinship all tied the people to their land. Thanes, peasants, and warriors alike saw Harold not as an abstract ruler, but as a living symbol of their identity. And that identity would soon face its greatest trial. For in the mid-11th century, the storm clouds were already gathering. Across the sea, powerful rulers watched England's throne with hungry eyes. And within, the question loomed: what would happen when Edward died childless? Harold, the strongest man in the kingdom, was destined to play a role no Anglo-Saxon noble had dared before. He would reach for the crown itself. The year 1066 was to become one of the most fateful in English history. On January 5th, King Edward the Confessor, after years of frailty and spiritual withdrawal, finally breathed his last. His death left the throne vacant, and with no direct heir, a storm of claims erupted. Harold Godwinson was the obvious choice within England. He was crowned the very next day, January 6th, in Westminster Abbey. To the Anglo-Saxon nobility and the people, this was both logical and necessary. Harold had defended England, managed its politics, and commanded loyalty like no other. He was seen not as a usurper, but as the guardian of continuity in a dangerous time. Yet outside England, his coronation ignited fury. In Norway, King Harold Hardrada asserted that he had a legitimate claim to the English throne, based on an old pact between Scandinavian rulers and previous English kings. Hardrada was not just another claimant. He was a seasoned warrior, the thunderbolt of the north, who had fought in far-off lands from Byzantium to the rivers of Russia. His ambitions were matched by his military might, and England was within his reach. Even more dangerous was William, Duke of Normandy. Across the Channel, William believed that Edward the Confessor had promised him the crown years earlier. To bolster his case, William also claimed that Harold himself had sworn an oath of loyalty to support his succession, an oath allegedly made during Harold's visit to Normandy in 1064, under circumstances that remain disputed. Whether true or exaggerated, William seized the opportunity to frame Harold as a perjurer and traitor. Thus, when Harold placed the crown upon his head, he did not merely inherit Edward's throne. He stepped into a battlefield of competing ambitions. In the eyes of his enemies, his kingship was illegitimate. To them, Harold was a pretender who had snatched what was not his. For Harold, however, the crown was not just a prize but a responsibility. He had risen from the power of his family, but now he bore the weight of a kingdom. Every decision he made would be tested not in councils, but in war. His enemies would not send envoys alone, they would send armies. The year had barely begun, and already England stood in peril. From the north, Hardrada prepared his fleet. From the south, William marshaled his knights. And in the heart of England, Harold raised his banners, swore to defend his realm, and braced himself for the storm to come. This was not just a dispute over succession, it was the beginning of the end for an entire world. The Anglo-Saxon kingdom, rooted in centuries of tradition, stood on the edge of annihilation, and Harold, the last great earl turned king, would be its final defender. To his people, Harold was not simply a king seated on a throne. He was a warrior who lived among them. Unlike Edward the Confessor, who preferred cloisters to battlefields, Harold's strength was his physical presence and martial skill. He fought in the shield wall, ate with his men, and carried scars from earlier campaigns. This visibility made him not only a ruler, but a symbol of resilience. The Anglo-Saxon army was not a permanent force like that of the Normans. It was a levy of farmers and local warriors called the Fyrd, who could only be called upon for short periods before needing to return to their fields. Harold, aware of this weakness, compensated with personal loyalty. His housecarls, professional warriors armed with massive axes, formed the backbone of his army. They fought not just for coin, but out of allegiance to Harold himself. On the battlefield, Harold's presence mattered more than any banner. Chroniclers describe him as tall, strong, and commanding. When he stood at the front line, his men believed the gods, or perhaps God himself, favored them. He inspired a unity that no foreign invader could replicate. In the eyes of the Anglo-Saxon soldiers, Harold was England incarnate. But Harold's role went beyond swords and shields. He was a mediator among fractious nobles, a unifier of earls who otherwise might have turned on one another. His authority stemmed from respect, not fear, and this gave him a kind of moral strength that held the fragile kingdom together. As storms brewed from across the seas, the English people saw Harold as their protector. He was not just defending a crown, he was safeguarding their farms, their language, their traditions. Every Anglo-Saxon village, from the smallest hamlet to the halls of the nobility, looked to Harold with the same hope, that he could shield them from the tide of foreign conquest. Harold's reign would be short, but it burned brightly with this sense of guardianship. His people knew he would fight to the last breath, and soon he would be forced to prove it. England in 1066 faced not one enemy, but two. To the north, Harold Hardrada of Norway assembled a fleet of hundreds of ships, determined to seize the crown through fire and steel. To the south, William of Normandy marshaled his knights, cavalry, and archers, preparing to cross the Channel. For Harold Godwinson, this meant fighting two wars at once, a task almost beyond human endurance. In late summer, news arrived that Hardrada had landed in Yorkshire. His forces swept inland, supported by Harold's own estranged brother, Tostig, who sought revenge after being exiled. The north of England was vulnerable, and Harold knew he could not wait. Gathering his fyrd and housecarls, he marched north with breathtaking speed, covering miles that would exhaust lesser armies. But even as he prepared to meet Hardrada, the threat of Normandy loomed. William had been building his invasion force for months, blessed by papal approval that painted Harold as an oath-breaker. With his cavalry trained in devastating tactics, William represented a new kind of warfare that the Anglo-Saxons had never faced. Harold was trapped in an impossible dilemma: defend the north against the Norwegians, or wait in the south to repel the Normans. To hesitate meant disaster. To choose one front meant exposing the other. Yet Harold chose action. He would strike swiftly at Hardrada before William could make his move. It was a gamble born of necessity. England was not strong enough to withstand both invasions at once. Harold placed his faith in speed, discipline, and the loyalty of his warriors. If he could crush the Norwegians quickly, perhaps he could still face William. Thus began one of the most grueling campaigns in English history, a race across the kingdom, where every step Harold took was measured against the advancing shadow of two foreign kings. His fate and the fate of Anglo-Saxon England now hung in a precarious balance. On September 25, 1066, Harold Godwinson achieved what many thought impossible. After marching his army nearly 200 miles in less than 4 days, he surprised Harold Hardrada and the Norwegian invaders at Stamford Bridge near York. The Norwegians, caught off guard after their initial victory at Fulford, were unprepared for the speed and ferocity of Harold's advance. The battle began with chaos. The English charged across the bridge, meeting the Viking shield wall head-on. For hours, steel clashed against steel, and blood stained the fields. Chroniclers tell of a lone Norse warrior who held the narrow bridge against the English, felling dozens before being brought down. His defiance epitomized the savage resistance Harold's men had to overcome. Yet Harold's leadership turned the tide. His housecarls fought with unmatched discipline, cutting through the disorganized Norwegians. Hardrada himself, a veteran of countless wars, fell in the fray, struck by an arrow to the throat. With their king slain and their forces crumbling, the Norse army collapsed. By the end of the day, the ground was littered with thousands of corpses. Only a fraction of the Norwegian fleet returned home. Harold had delivered a decisive victory that secured England's northern borders. The Anglo-Saxons rejoiced. Their king had saved them from one invader. But victory came at a terrible cost. Harold's army was exhausted, its numbers thinned, its men bruised and battered. And just as the dead were cleared from Stamford Bridge, dire news arrived. William of Normandy had landed in the south. Harold's triumph turned bitter. There would be no time to rest, no time to celebrate. The king was forced once more to march, this time back to the very opposite end of his kingdom. What should have been his moment of glory became the beginning of his downfall. On October 14th, less than 3 weeks after Stamford Bridge, Harold faced William of Normandy on the rolling hills near Hastings. His army, weary from the forced march, took position atop Senlac Hill, where they built the legendary shield wall, a barrier of overlapping shields, behind which spears and axes bristled. The Normans attacked in waves, William's cavalry, knights clad in mail, charged uphill only to be beaten back by the English wall. Arrows darkened the sky, yet the Anglo-Saxons held firm. Time and again, Norman attacks faltered. The hills seemed to belong to Harold. At one point, William himself was rumored dead, causing panic among his men. But the Duke revealed his face, rallying his forces. He then adapted strategy, feigning retreats that lured parts of Harold's army into breaking formation. These false routes weakened the shield wall, exposing gaps. Still, the battle raged for hours. The Anglo-Saxons fought with desperate courage, their axes cleaving horse and rider alike. Harold's presence at the center of the line gave his men strength, but fatigue gnawed at them. Unlike the Normans, they lacked archers in great numbers, and their infantry had borne the brunt of constant assault. As the afternoon dragged on, the balance shifted. The Norman cavalry pressed harder, exploiting every weakness. Harold's men, stretched to their limits, could not hold forever. Hastings was not a single clash, but a grinding test of endurance. Both sides shed blood in rivers. Yet behind every sword swing, one truth loomed. If Harold fell, England itself would fall. As the sun sank lower over the battlefield of Hastings, the fight entered its most desperate stage. Both armies were exhausted, yet neither yielded. It was then that fate dealt its cruelest blow. Amid a storm of arrows released by Norman archers, one shaft arced high into the air and came down with merciless precision, piercing Harold Godwinson through the eye. The king staggered, clutching at the shaft lodged in his face. For his men, the sight was catastrophic. Their anchor, their inspiration, had been struck. Chroniclers differ on the exact details. Some claim Harold fell instantly, others that he was cut down afterward by Norman swords. But all agree his fall shattered Anglo-Saxon resistance. The shield wall, which had held firm for hours, now buckled. Panic rippled through the ranks. Without Harold's steady presence, cohesion dissolved into chaos. The Normans pressed forward, exploiting every gap, their cavalry trampling those who fled. For the Anglo-Saxons, it was the moment when hope bled out of them. The king who had led them from the north to the south, who had triumphed at Stamford Bridge, was no more. What remained was only the sound of steel, screams, and the relentless advance of a foreign army. The arrow that struck Harold was more than a weapon. It was a symbol. In that instant, the old England, the land of the Anglo-Saxons, died with him. The fate of the kingdom turned on a single moment of chance, a shaft of wood and iron that carried with it the weight of destiny. When the battle finally ended, the field of Hastings was carpeted with corpses. Among them lay the broken body of King Harold. What happened next became the subject of legend and controversy. Some accounts claim that his body was so mutilated by Norman soldiers that it could barely be recognized. Others insist he was cut into pieces, his remains desecrated as a warning to all who opposed William. What is certain is that Harold's end was ignominious. The mighty king who had led armies and defended England's shores was reduced to a mangled corpse. According to tradition, it was Edith the Fair, his longtime companion, who identified him by markings known only to her. The image is haunting, a woman weeping over the ravaged remains of the last Anglo-Saxon king, surrounded by silence and ruin. For the Normans, Harold was an enemy extinguished. For the Anglo-Saxons, his death was more than personal grief. It was humiliation. Their leader had not only been slain, but dishonored in death. The sight of his body, desecrated and stripped of dignity, symbolized the subjugation of an entire people. In that moment, the battlefield at Hastings was not just a graveyard. It was the tomb of a culture. blood of Harold mingled with that of his warriors, marking the end of Anglo-Saxon independence. His fall was not just military defeat, but cultural annihilation. The man who had been England's protector was gone, and in his place stood a conqueror whose language, laws, and power would reshape the island forever. Harold's remains faded into the soil, but the tragedy of his end lingered as a wound that never healed. With Harold Godwinson lying lifeless on the field, William of Normandy seized his long-sought prize. The victory at Hastings crowned him not merely as a conqueror, but as the new King of England. On Christmas Day 1066, William was anointed at Westminster Abbey, a moment that symbolized the end of Anglo-Saxon rule and the dawn of a new order. The Norman conquest reshaped England from the ground up. William imposed his authority with ruthless efficiency, confiscating Anglo-Saxon lands and redistributing them to his Norman barons. The old aristocracy was swept aside, replaced by foreigners loyal to the conqueror. Castles rose across the landscape, towers of stone that loomed over villages, daily reminders of Norman dominance. Language, too, began to change. French became the tongue of the court and nobility, mingling with Old English to form the roots of modern English. Law, governance, and even the church were reshaped to reflect Norman customs. England was no longer an isolated Anglo-Saxon realm. It was now tied by blood and politics to continental Europe. For the common people, the conquest brought hardship. Taxes increased, freedoms diminished, and the once familiar lords of the land were replaced by strangers. Resistance flared across the country, from the harrowing of the North to scattered uprisings. But William crushed them all with relentless force. The death of Harold was not simply the loss of a king. It was the erasure of an entire political order. The Anglo-Saxon world, with its traditions of local lordship and kinship, was dismantled piece by piece. In its place rose a centralized, militarized monarchy that would define England for centuries. Hastings was not only a battle, it was the hinge upon which England's destiny swung, forever altering the path of its history. Harold Godwinson's reign lasted only 9 months, yet his legacy endures. He is remembered as the last native king of Anglo-Saxon England, a ruler who rose not through divine inheritance, but through merit, power, and loyalty. His tragic fall at Hastings has immortalized him as a symbol of both heroism and loss. For the Anglo-Saxons, Harold's death marked the end of their independence. He embodied their values: courage, loyalty, and connection to the land. In dying with an arrow through his eye, he became a martyr for a vanished world. Generations after the conquest, stories of Harold lingered, whispered in halls and villages, of the king who stood firm when the tide of history turned against him. Historians debate the exact details of his death, but in popular memory, the image of Harold struck in the eye has become iconic. It appears on the Bayeux tapestry, stitched into cloth by Norman hands, yet ironically preserving the Anglo-Saxon king's final moment for eternity. His defeat was meant to legitimize William's rule, but it also ensured Harold would never be forgotten. Today, Harold is seen not just as a failed king, but as a tragic figure, a man caught between fate and inevitability. His death reminds us of how swiftly power can vanish, how fragile kingdoms truly are. Though the Normans built a New England, Harold Godwinson's name still resonates. He is remembered as the last of his line, the king who stood against 2 invasions in a single year, and who died defending his homeland. After him, England would never again be purely Anglo-Saxon. The arrow that felled Harold pierced not only his eye, but the very heart of a nation.